Welcome to In-Silico Trials Real Impact, the In-Silico UK podcast that's revolutionizing the way we think about medical innovation. I'm Professor 𝗪𝗵𝘁 from the University of Manchester, and I'll be your guide through this fascinating world of in-silico technologies. In each episode, we'll dive into cutting-edge research and groundbreaking news that are shaping the future of medical product development and regulation. From computational modeling to simulated clinical trials, we are exploring how digital approaches are transforming healthcare, making it safer, more efficient, more equitable, and incredibly precise. So, whether you're a researcher, regulator, a member of the public, or a patient representative, or simply curious about the future of medicine, tune in as we unravel the complex world of in-silico methods and their real-world impact. Get ready to discover how computer-simulated trials are leading to very real breakthroughs in patient care. In-Silico Trials Real Impact, where algorithms and data are saving lives. Let's begin.
All right, so today we're going to be diving into something pretty cool.
Yeah.
It's all about, how we test new medical devices,
right?
Clinical trials.
Yeah.
Everybody knows those are like super important. We got to make sure that these devices are, safe.
Of course.
And actually do what they're supposed to do before we,
absolutely
let people actually use them.
Yeah.
But the thing is, those trials can sometimes take forever.
They can.
And they cost a ton of money.
Yeah, it's a real challenge.
And, that lag, that can mean that patients,
right.
they end up waiting way longer than they should for some of these new treatments.
Exactly. And that's, one of the biggest things that we're always trying to grapple with.
For sure.
How can we make the process more efficient without, sacrificing safety or accuracy?
Absolutely. So that's kind of the heart of what we're looking at today.
Yeah.
We're going to get into these things called virtual patient models.
Okay.
And stochastic engineering models. And the idea here is these techniques, they have this potential to basically supercharge our traditional clinical trials.
Right.
Give us more information faster.
That's the goal.
And we're going to be using a really cool paper from the Journal of Biopharmaceutical Statistics as our guide for this one.
Okay. Sounds good.
So let's jump right in.
Right.
Virtual patients.
Okay.
This sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie or something, but what are they?
So basically you can think of them as like these really advanced computer simulations.
Okay.
And they're trying to recreate how a real person would react to a medical device.
Got it.
But the thing is, it's not just like based on, the average person.
Right.
These models actually use like hardcore engineering principles.
Wow.
And all this complex computer modeling to try and like really capture the range of how different people might respond.
That makes sense.
And the real power here is that they can actually reflect the diversity we see in the real world. So like age, body size, even how a disease might affect different people in different ways.
So it's like making a digital twin for a whole bunch of different kinds of patients.
Exactly. And it gets even better because these models can even take into account that medical devices themselves aren't always exactly the same.
Right.
Like there can be tiny differences in how they're manufactured, their dimensions, how long they last.
Mm-hmm.
So by building these like super detailed virtual representations, we can basically run tons of simulations to see how a device might work in a huge variety of situations.
That's amazing. So can you give us like a real world example of how this would play out?
Sure.
The paper had a couple, right?
Yeah, they did. So like one example that they talked about that I thought was really clear was in diabetes management.
Okay.
So like imagine you're trying to test a new insulin pump or a continuous glucose monitor.
Right.
You want to see how well it controls blood sugar. So you can build a virtual patient model.
Oh.
And you can simulate people with different levels of insulin sensitivity, different diets, activity patterns, you name it.
Wow.
And then the model can actually predict how their blood glucose would respond to that device in all those different conditions.
And all of this is happening inside the computer.
In the computer.
Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah.
So you're essentially testing it on like this huge virtual population before you ever even get to a real person.
Exactly. And that was one example.
Okay. What was the other one?
The other one that I thought was really interesting was about ICD leads.
ICD leads.
Yeah.
Okay. So those are the implantable cardioverter defibrillators.
Yes.
And the leads are the wires that connect it to the heart.
Right. So they're what actually deliver the therapy.
Got it.
To help regulate the heart's rhythm.
And the paper was focused on the risk of those leads fracturing over time.
Yeah. So that's obviously a big concern.
Yeah.
You don't want that to happen. So in this case, a virtual patient model could simulate the mechanical stress that the lead experiences with every single heartbeat.
Wow.
And it would consider things like the size of the person's heart, how active they are, even the exact way the lead was implanted during surgery.
So it's like a super personalized virtual representation.
Exactly.
And then by running these simulations for what would be years of use in a real person, you can start to get a much better understanding of where the weak points might be and how long that lead might realistically last.
Exactly.
That's amazing. And I think the paper made a really interesting point that, like, the number of these virtual patients you could have is basically only limited by computing power.
Right.
Which is so different from a real-world trial where
You're limited by how many people you can recruit.
Yeah.
And you know how long you can actually follow them for.
Exactly.
Here you could create these enormous virtual cohorts.
Right. And get so much more data.
Way more data.
So much faster.
And that's one of the key takeaways here.
Okay.
It's not just about the simulations themselves. No. It's that these virtual patients, they generate a ton of information just in a digital form.
Yeah.
And when you use that data wisely, it can give you insights that might have taken you much longer to find in a traditional trial.
Totally. So we've got these virtual patients, these really detailed simulations.
Right.
Now let's talk about the other piece of this.
Okay.
Which is these stochastic engineering models.
Right.
What are those and how do they fit into all of this?
So think of stochastic engineering models as kind of the engine that powers those virtual patients. They're basically mathematical models, but they're probabilistic.
Probabilistic. What does that mean?
So instead of giving you like a single definitive answer, they actually incorporate uncertainty into both the design of the device and all the information we have about how it works.
Uncertainty in the design itself, that sounds a little...
I know it sounds scary, but it's actually a more realistic way to look at things. Because any model we create, it's always going to be a simplification of reality.
Right.
There's always going to be some things we don't know or can't perfectly capture. So stochastic models, they acknowledge that. And they use probability to represent that uncertainty.
So instead of saying this device will last for 10 years. It might say there's an 80% chance it'll last between 8 and 12 years?
Exactly.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
So how does that apply to our ICD lead example?
So in that case, one of the key factors is the bending stress on the lead every time the heart beats.
Right.
So the model would use data. Often from imaging of real patients.
Got it.
To try and understand the typical range and the distribution of those bending stresses.
Makes sense.
And then separately, engineers actually do tests in the lab where they see how many bending cycles a lid can withstand before it breaks.
So they're combining like real-world data with controlled lab testing.
Exactly.
That's really cool.
And the important thing is because there's natural variation in human anatomy, how the lead's implanted, even the materials the lead's made of. These models don't just give you a single number for bending stress or cycles to failure. They actually use these things called statistical distributions, which is basically a way to represent the range of possibilities.
Got it.
And how likely each possibility is.
Okay, so that's where the uncertainty comes in.
Exactly.
So we've got these ranges of possible stresses and how many bends it can take. But how do you connect that to a real-world outcome, like when the lead might actually fracture?
So for that, you use what's called a transfer function, which is kind of like a mathematical link that connects those engineering outputs, the number of cycles, the stress, to a clinically relevant outcome, which in this case would be time to lead fracture. So, for example, you might estimate the average number of heartbeats per year and then calculate how long it would take for the lead to hit its breaking point.
Based on those simulated stresses. Okay, so this stochastic engineering model, by taking all of this uncertainty into account, ultimately feeds into that virtual patient model.
Exactly.
And that's what allows it to simulate these different real-world outcomes.
And that's super important for these virtual patient models to be really helpful. They have to simulate the actual clinical outcome we care about.
Makes sense.
It's not enough to just model the engineering. You have to connect it to what we'd actually see in real patients.
So the paper then goes on to talk about how you can actually use this virtual patient data in conjunction with like a real-world clinical trial. And they talk about something called the power prior method. What is that?
So the 𝗪𝗁 is a really cool statistical way to include information that you already have.
Okay.
In this case, the data from the virtual patients into the analysis of a new clinical trial.
Got it.
So it's like you're combining what you learned from the simulations with the real-world evidence that you're starting to gather.
So it's like giving those virtual patients a voice in the real-world results.
Yeah. So the 𝗪𝗁 basically uses that data from the virtual patients to create a prior belief about how the device might perform.
Okay.
And then as you collect data from the actual trial, that belief gets updated based on the new evidence. And the power part refers to this parameter that controls how much weight you give.
To that virtual patient data.
To that prior information,
So it's like a dial that you can adjust to control the influence of the virtual patients.
Exactly. And that's really important because you don't want to rely too much on the virtual data if it turns out that the real-world performance is totally different.
Totally. So how do you decide where to set that dial?
So that's where the discount function comes in, which is this really smart way to automatically adjust the weight that you're giving to the virtual patients based on how well their simulated outcomes match up with the real patient data.
Oh, that's cool.
So it's kind of like a built-in reality check for the virtual patient.
I like that.
So if the early data from the real patients looks really different from what your model predicted, the discount function will actually reduce the effective number of virtual patients that you're considering.
So it's like saying, okay, our model might not be perfect.
Right.
Let's trust the real-world data a little bit more.
Exactly.
But if the data is lining up nicely,
then it might let you give more weight to the virtual patients.
So it's like a dynamic balancing act.
It is.
It's really cool. So it lets you use all this information you have available, but also be appropriately cautious when those virtual patients might not be telling the whole story.
Exactly. And that's the key. It's all about finding that right balance between using everything you know and being realistic about where the model might be off.
And ultimately, this has the potential to make those trials more efficient.
Exactly.
And get those devices to patients faster.
That's the goal.
This has been so interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
I mean, it's really incredible to think about how this technology and these models can really change how we test these devices.
It really does open up a lot of possibilities for doing things better and faster.
And potentially, like, totally reshape how we think about the human body and how it responds to these therapies.
Cool.
So as you're thinking about all of this, I want you to consider how these techniques might change not just how we test devices, but also how we predict and understand the human body's response to new treatments.
That's a big one.
It's a huge question.
It is.
About the future of medical innovation.
Yeah, for sure.
And if you're interested in learning more, I definitely recommend checking out the principles of Bayesian statistics in clinical trials.
Good place to start.
And the whole field of computational modeling in medicine.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.